Now in the previous lecture, which is lecture 4, we had talked about Python variables. Now when it comes to the naming of your variables, you can pretty much call them whatever you want. So instead of calling this variable name, we can call it n, and instead of calling length variable length, we can call it l, and we need to put over here n also, and we need to print out l. Now after changing it, if we run our code, you'll see that our code works the way that we worked before. So if I run it and hit enter, you see that everything works the way that worked before. So there is no differences if you put over here name or n, so you can call it whatever you want. Now, but here, there's a couple of rules you should probably follow. And the most important one is we need to make our code readable. Because if you come back to your code after 6 or 12 months, n or l will be meaningless. So you need to examine your code carefully to understand the meaning of these variables over here. So it's always recommended to use variable name which makes sense. So we need to try to make sure that this variable makes sense to you after sometimes when you come back to your code. And to make your variables more understandable, you can even use multiple naming. So for example, if I want to name this variable name as username, I can put it like this, user underscore name. So for multiple wording, you can write user underscore name. Instead of spacing, you can use underscore in Python. So one more time, if I run our code, you see that our code works the way that it should be. So everything works perfect. Now another way of writing multiple wording, you can use camel casing. So in case of camel case, so the first word starts with lowercase. Then when you reach the second word, you are starting with the uppercase. So it is like this. So you can just copy it from here and put it over here. So there is two ways of writing multiple words in Python. So you can use with underscore or you can use camel casing. So both of them will work correct. So if I run our code one more time, you see that everything works the way that it should be. Now when you are writing multiple words, you need to take into account that you cannot write space over here. So if I put, for example, space between these two words over here and try to run our code, you will see that it will give us syntax error because Python does not accept spaces in the variable name. So you need to take into account that this is not valid code. So when you run it, you will get syntax error in Python. So you can either separate words with underscore or you can use camel case in your variable name. Now if you want to use numbers in name of your variable, you can do it. For example, I can write over here length 1. So I can print out over here. So you'll see that everything works perfect. So we don't have any error over here. The code works the way it should be. So we can put it over here length 1 or length 2. So whatever you want. But here you need to take into account that you cannot put number at the beginning of your variable. So if I put, for example, in the beginning of length 1 length, so run our code, you will see that we are getting syntax error one more time. So you need to take into account that a variable name cannot be started with the number. We can put the numbers at the end of variable name, but we cannot put it at the beginning of the name of the variable. So we cannot say one length because it will generate a syntax error. So finally, there are certain privileged words that in Python we cannot use it as variable name. So these are the reserved words in Python. So you can find the list over here. So these are the name of built-in functionalities in Python. So for example, function name like input or print, we cannot use them as a variable name. For example, instead of username, if I put over here input, so here you can easily see that syntax highlighting gets messed up by coloring the variable name like function name. So normally the variable name is white and function names in yellow, but in this case both of them is in yellow. Now if I run our code, now in this case you see that it's working the way that it should be, but here the syntax highlighting get messed up, so it's not advisable to use it. For example, instead of this one, if I put over here class and try to print out class, you'll see that this time it's going to give the error. Here we have a syntax error, so it's not advisable to use these reserved words in Python as variable name. Now the final thing to remember is that if you decide to call your variable name, for example name, and which is name, and at the later point you put over here, for example nmaa, and try to run your code, you will see that in this case you have name error. So this is because it says the name is not defined. So here the idea is you need to look at the error line. So in this case it's line 2. So when you go to the line 2, you see that you mistyped the variable name. So here you declared it as name, but here you put it as nama. So in this case If you correct it, you will fix it. So if I correct it, you see that everything works. It should be. Now here I want you to remember that this is not because Python doing any spelling check for you. So it's not like spell checker in the text editor. So in English, for example, if you type the name wrong, so the spell checker checks it and shows you that this is wrong spell checker, but Python is not working the way that the spell checkers work. In fact, if you decide to call this variable nama and printing out it later, so Python will not care about it. So it will work without any error. So it's not going to raise any error. So as long as these two spellings are identical, then the computer does not care about it. So it will process it. So you need to take into account that it's not working the way that the spell checkers work. So when you get a name error in your code, you need to know that it's probably because you have misspelled or mistyped one of the variable names somewhere in your code. So you are checking the error line and going back and checking the variable name, that if you put it correct or not. Now this is all for this lecture. So hopefully you have understood how can we name our variables in Python.